We keep getting asked a lot of Cymbidium questions, and we thought it's time to do a Q&A on it because it's now Cymbidium time, and if you're looking to get one or you're worried about yours coming into flower, then this is the video for you. We're going to help answer some of those most frequently asked questions. Ed's compiled a list for me of all the most commonly asked questions and given me a clipboard and a pencil so that I look official. Well, maybe getting the pencil to stay behind my ear is going to be more difficult than getting your Cymbidium to flower, but we'll get to that. So, step aside, official coming through. Welcome to the Nature Company. Today, we're going to be looking at all of those most frequently asked Cymbidium questions. So hopefully today we can break down the mystique and the mystery of getting Cymbidiums to flower and grow beautifully so you can enjoy them too. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Cymbidiums appear tricky to grow and even more difficult to flower, but they're not really. Ed has meticulously and carefully gone and taken down everyone's questions that they've been asking, put together in the most frequently asked questions and put them into categories for me. So I've got a nice little clipboard here with all the questions so that I don't get lost. And as we know, if it weren't for him, I can't even barely keep a pencil in my ear. So let's get straight down to those questions that you've been asking. And he's divided them into categories very nicely for us so we can go through them carefully. It's from the flowering questions, the care questions, fertilizing questions, pest and disease questions, and of course the growing questions. So we'll go through each of these sections one by one so that at least that way it helps me keep my mind on what I'm talking about. The flowering questions we'll put at the end because that's the final stage of the care cycle before we begin again. So let's get to the care questions first. Number one, how much light do Cymbidiums need? A lot of people, especially indoor growers, ask this because they're not sure how much light they must give their Cymbidiums. Cymbidiums, unlike a lot of other orchids, require extreme light conditions. They really do like lots and lots of light. So sometimes this can be difficult to reproduce in your home environment. Cymbidiums will often even take all day full sun if they become acclimatized to it. And you know when you're giving your Cymbidium enough light, when your leaves start to almost look a yellowy, sickly color. It doesn't seem like it should be right, but that's what it is. That's when your Cymbidium is getting enough sun so that it can build up enough energy for that flowering. So Cymbidium's sun requirements are on the very high side compared to most of your other orchids. And then hand in hand with that question is, can I grow Cymbidiums indoors? Cymbidiums are generally better grown outdoors because of that high light that they need. Also, they need immense amounts of air movement to avoid any rotting that could happen in between them, because we can see how much foliage that they do get, and they need that air movement to be blowing through because they like a fair amount of moisture, especially during that growing period. And if they're not getting all that air movement, they can rot really easily. So high light, good air movement, and also they need those temperature variations in late summer to early autumn or through autumn to produce the flowers. So if your indoor temperatures are constant throughout the year, you're going to have trouble getting your Cymbidiums to flower. But other than that, yes, they can be grown indoors, but not as easily as some of your other orchids. And then along with that then becomes the next question is, what temperatures are best for your Cymbidiums? Cymbidiums are actually quite flexible in the temperature ranges that they can grow in, but in order to get them to flower, you are going to have to give them a diurnal change in temperature of at least 10 to 15 degrees. So if your evening temperatures are going to be around 10 degrees, then your daytime temperatures are going to need to be at least 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. And if you're looking at Fahrenheit, you're looking at around 50 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit. then the daytime temperatures would need to be at least 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's what will help your plant flower. And this is going to be especially essential during those periods from late summer through autumn and even into winter, because they do need an extended period of that cooling. Around 10 to 12 weeks of that 10 to 15 degrees temperature change between your daytime and your evenings and your days and your nights. But I guess you get what I mean. And remember, the warmer your temperatures are, the more air movement you're going to need for your plant, and probably the more frequently you're going to have to water it. And with that watering, that comes to our next question. How often should I water my Cymbidium? Cymbidiums are quite vigorous growers during their growing season, so spring and summer, water frequently. Make sure that they've always got enough water. Don't let them dry out too much. But don't keep them soggy. And make sure you've got that air movement through them again, because with all that moisture that they like, avoid stagnant air conditions. And then as they start moving into their flowering season, start reducing that watering. And then in winter, you can almost stop watering altogether, especially if your temperatures are cooler and your medium is staying just ever so slightly moist. They don't want to necessarily dry out completely, but allow them to dry slightly. You may have to give them a little bit of a sprinkling of water every now and again during those winter periods, but don't keep them too wet or you will rot all the roots inside your pots. And they have those big, nice, voluptuous roots, and if they're holding too much moisture, they will rot on you. So their growth slows down in winter and they're not going to be using any of that moisture. So just relax on the watering during that winter period. And then often what comes in conjunction with watering is, should I mist my Cymbidium? Cymbidiums don't necessarily need to be misted, as long as you're keeping their humidity level in the range of between 40 and 60, which is actually quite an easy range to maintain for a lot of people indoors and especially outdoors. So if your humidity levels are in between in that range at all, then you probably won't need to mist your Cymbidium. Of course, if you do have very low humidities indoors, if you're using heaters or air conditioners or whatever it may be, then perhaps you may want to give the leaves a light spray occasionally, just to overcome the fact that there's such low humidities in the air. But you would probably be better off by using evaporation trays or a humidifier to get that same humidity, to bring your humidity levels up to the required levels. So those are generally the most frequently asked care questions for Cymbidiums. So let's move on to the repotting and dividing questions that are most frequently asked about Cymbidiums. When should I repot my Cymbidium? This is probably one of the most frequently asked questions overall. Cymbidiums should only be repotted after flowering. You wait for after flowering and you wait for those new growths to appear. And as soon as you see new root growth on the base of those growths, that's the time that you want to get in repot. So you wait for the flowers to end and then those new growths to set. So this is probably going to be in spring or possibly even as late as early summer that you are then going to be repotting your Cymbidiums. And Cymbidiums you only really need to repot every 2 to 3 years or so when the pot starts getting overcrowded. If you start seeing it outgrow its pot, also if you notice you are getting a lot of old leafless pseudobulbs in the center of your plant, then it's time to repot. This is also the point that you're going to be dividing it. Those old pseudobulbs can actually start using up energy from the plant itself. So it's going to be best to remove the majority of those old leafless pseudobulbs off your plant, leaving a minimum of 4 to 5 bulbs in a clump, including those new growths. And those back bulbs, don't just throw them away. You can use them to propagate more of your plant too. Also remember, repotting of your Cymbidiums needs to be done on a regular basis, because if they do get too big and outgrown in their pot, they can actually be quite a difficult plant to repot, as you can see in some of our Cymbidium repotting videos. they can become big and overgrown, and then you have to fight with them a bit to get them repotted. Okay, let's move along. What's the best mix for potting Cymbidiums in? The best mix for Cymbidiums is up to you. We want a nice, well-drained media that's still going to hold moisture in it long enough. I generally use a media with some soil in it, so a soil-based media, although a lot of other growers may grow in pure bark or in bark with perlite and sphagnum moss. There's so many different mixes available for your Cymbidiums, but a lot of them will be dependent on where you're growing your Cymbidiums, how you're growing your Cymbidiums, and your climate. So take all of those into account when choosing your Cymbidium mix, because remember, not all mixes are going to work for everyone in the climates that they live in. We have an amazing mix that we've started using recently that we're having great results with here. So we'll link that video down in the description box below. I've just called it our Darjeeling mix because that's where we got the idea of it from. And then of course how do I divide my Cymbidium? Well, it will be at that repotting stage that you've removed it from the pot and taken out all that media. That's the only way you're going to actually see what's happening with your plant and where the best point for that division is going to be. And remember, you want a minimum of 4 to 5 of those pseudobulbs attached to a single piece. You can go as low as 3, but then remember, you probably won't get blooms of it in the next year. It could take 2 years from that point to rebloom again. So when dividing your Cymbidiums, try to divide into the biggest clumps available to you. That way you can be more sure that you'll get flowers in the next season. Because Cymbidiums are generally known that if you repot them, they sulk for a year or two. But if you repot them correctly in the right way, you can actually get blooms in the following year if you've got your repotting done at the right time and not removed too much of the plant itself. There are vigorous growers, and that new growth can still mature in time to bloom. Now we get to the fertilization questions. And there's only really 2 questions that most people ask there, is what fertilizer should I use on my Cymbidiums? If you check out my previous videos on the repotting, I generally use manure of some sort as I repot my Cymbidiums. This gives them the nitrogen boost that they need for that vigorous growth that's going to happen in spring and summer. And the balance of the feed that I feed my Cymbidiums is then a generalized all-purpose organic fertilizer to give them the full array of nutrients that they're going to need to grow. And remember, don't continue feeding with high nitrogen fertilizers, because your Cymbidiums will then stay in a vegetative growth phase. So after that initial high nitrogen boost, as they move into summer and into autumn, some people like to give them a high phosphorus fertilizer at that point to help initiate flower spike development. But with my organic fertilizers, I just start weaning it off until winter, where I don't feed at all. So remember, high nitrogen fertilizers for that initial vegetative growth phase, and then move to an all-round general fertilizer, and perhaps, if you want to, a high phosphorus fertilizer for blooming. And then the other fertilization question is, how often should I fertilize my Cymbidiums? Cymbidiums are heavy feeders, so I fertilize every week. So depending on the strength or concentration of fertilizer that you're feeding them, feed them every week or every second week. And then as it comes around to winter, you want to possibly only feed yours once a month during that winter period. And now we've got to the section, all those nasties that attack your orchids. It's the pests and diseases that Cymbidiums get. The questions here are, what pests attack Cymbidiums? Or should we really say, what pests don't? But really, they're actually quite tough plants. Not too many things attack them too badly. You're mostly going to get aphids, and that's going to be predominantly on your flowers. You're going to get mealybugs, which will creep down in between your Leaf sheaths, spider mite. Spider mite you'll see all over your plant and leaving their nasty little spider mite bites. And of course, scale. Scale is probably the most insidious of all of them, but with a little bit of tea tree hydrosol or something, we can just wipe them all off. It's only when we start having to get into these leaf sheaths that's difficult to get into that you might want to then spray something a little bit more dangerous. And then remember also with Cymbidiums, slugs and snails are a big problem. They will eat your flower spikes as they are produced. As they start shooting out of the ground or out of the pseudobulb and they start elongating, Cymbidiums have their honeydew that they produce and they start that right from early. The slugs and snails go for that. It's happy days for them. It's like me at an ice cream bar. I'm going to eat everything I see. So just be careful of your slugs and snails, especially at that point when you know flowering is about to come around. The next most popular question after that is, how do I get rid of mealybugs on my Cymbidiums? Mealybugs are actually relatively easy to get rid of. Something like an insecticidal soap generally does the trick. Wiping them off with an isopropyl alcohol swab also kills them off immediately. So it's just a matter of going through your plant and just giving it a good wipe off and a little bit of a spray, and you've probably sorted the problem out. Also remember, if you get continual attacks from mealybugs, then it's very possible that your orchid itself is not feeling healthy and it's not able to fight off those initial attacks by itself. So they then start going rampant. So ensure that you have a healthy plant and you're less likely to have mealybug in the first place. And then when it comes to diseases, a lot of people say, I've got black spots on my Cymbidium. What are these black spots? Well, the black spots could be a number of different things. It could either be fungus, it could be bacterial, and it could also be something as simple as sunburn. Also, if you've had small physical damage to your plant, it's been beaten a little bit. Also, you can see those black marks that are almost like bruises that can also be just from mechanical damage. But if you are getting these black spots and it's not from mechanical damage or sunburn, then it's probably going to be either fungal or bacterial. And for this, what you're going to have to do is reduce your watering, or at least not water on the leaves itself. So water in around the base of the plant and put it in an area where it's got more air movement. We want high air movement through your plant, and that will help avoid any of those bacterial and fungal infections. Also, perhaps you need to move it to a brighter light area. The more light your plant gets, the less likely it's going to get fungal and bacterial diseases, because they don't like to be out in the full sun like that. So also things like using a little bit of neem oil occasionally can also help avoid any of those problems that you may get from that as well. Just a little bit of a prevention. And then of course, why are my Cymbidium leaves turning yellow? There could be several reasons for this. It could be nutrient deficiencies, so ensure that you are then feeding your plant properly. Calcium is one of the reasons that Cymbidium leaves can go yellow, so ensure that you are feeding with the full range of nutrients for your orchids. Especially since they are such heavy feeders and fast growers, they need a lot of food during that growing period. But don't go overboard. Another cause could be overfeeding. Nutrient toxicity, so be sure that you are flushing out your orchid if you are feeding with high concentrations or with chemical fertilizers as opposed to organic fertilizers. Also, the yellowing of the leaves, if it's not from too much sun, then it could be overwatering. So check that your media is not soggy and that you haven't rotted the roots. So it could be an early sign that your plant is taking a terrible turn. So just check in your pot to make sure you're not overwatering. And if none of those are the reason, look at which leaves are yellowing. If they're leaves from old pseudobulbs, then you just know that it's old age. Those are going to die off and fall off anyway. So you can just go through. If they've gone too yellow and you don't want that look on your plant, you want to keep it nice and clean, then you can go in and cut those off at any point. So if they're from those old pseudobulbs, what are considered back bulbs now, then you can remove those without a problem. But remember, you do get dying old age leaves just like we do. So just remember, not all yellowing is bad. Some of it's just from those old maturing leaves that are about to die off anyway. Old mature leaves. Okay, the growing questions that we get. Not much further and we're just about done. So what are the growing questions? Can Cymbidiums tolerate frost? Can they? Actually, yes, they can, as long as it's not for extended periods. There are growers who use sprinklers to avoid frost on their plants if they're growing in high frost areas. Sometimes the water from those sprinklers actually freezes over their whole plants, and by the time they defrost, the plants are still fine. And even those that are in flower are still okay. So Cymbidiums are really hardy plants. They come from those high mountainous areas in Asia, in around Nepal and India, and through into China. So they do accept cold. But remember, you're still going to have to protect them from extended periods of freezing temperatures. And also, just a side note, so Cymbidiums will probably tolerate those cold conditions better if your daytime temperatures do increase slightly above them. And if you're getting those bitterly cold temperatures at night, your Cymbidiums are more likely to withstand them better if your day temperatures rise higher. And anyway, that's what's going to help with their flowering. That 10 to 15 degrees increase in temperature over that period is generally what's going to help initiate those flower spikes. And then the other two growing questions that we get is, do Cymbidiums like to be pot bound, and how big do they get? Cymbidiums do like to be pot bound to a degree. As with all orchids, the smaller size of pot allows for faster drainage and generally better aeration through to the middle of the pot. So that's often got to do with more the reason that they like to be so-called pot bound is because you're not giving the orchid too much room that can hold moisture and stop air movement and all of those things that the orchids particularly like. And with regards to being pot bound, try not to let your Cymbidium overgrow itself, because then it can become a nightmare to repot. Getting through those roots and getting through the plant itself can be one hell of a nightmare. And as to the size of Cymbidiums, well, we can see how big this one is, and this isn't even the biggest that Cymbidiums can get. Cymbidiums can get to approximately 1 meter tall, sometimes 1.2 meters, depending on the type of Cymbidium it is. And we can see how wide they can grow, depending on the size pot that they're grown in and how often you're repotting. So they can actually become very large plants, which is one of the reasons that they're generally more grown outdoors than they are grown indoors. And now that you've got all the care and growing questions answered and avoided all those pests, we now get to the flowering. What are the most common flowering questions that we get for our Cymbidiums? And of course, the most asked question with Cymbidiums is, why isn't my Cymbidium flowering? So the most common problems here are the lack of a day-night temperature drop. That diurnal change in temperatures is important to help set the flowers in Cymbidiums. Also, insufficient light. If your Cymbidium is not getting enough light, it's not going to produce enough energy for those pseudobulbs to actually form those flower spikes. Also, overcrowding. If your pot is too overcrowded, there's going to be nowhere for the spikes to emerge from, or with that overcrowding, you're starting to get rot happening, and those new little shoots that come out will often be the first to rot off. Also, the plant itself won't be in a good enough state. It will be feeling dehydrated, probably malnourished, and all of those bad things, which is going to cause the plant not to bloom. And then also something a lot of people forget is using high nitrogen fertilizers in that late summer, autumn, and even winter periods. That's going to keep your plant in active vegetative growth, and it will avoid flowering. So remember to reduce your feeding or change to a high phosphorus and potassium feed for your orchids during that period. And there I've already slipped into the next second most asked question is, how do I get my Cymbidium to flower? Well, already as I've suggested with your fertilizers, change from the high nitrogen to either reduced concentrations or volumes of fertilizer, or change over to a high phosphorus and potassium fertilizer. And remember, those day-night temperature changes are going to be important, so at least between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius temperature change between your nighttime temperatures and your daytime temperatures. And that will help initiate those flower bulb spikes. Remember, for a period of between 10 and 12 weeks is probably going to be important. And then also in that late summer, early autumn period, or the period that it's starting to produce those flower spikes, make sure you have reduced your watering by then, because too much water at this point is going to cause those soft, tender, fresh growths to easily succumb to things like fungi and bacteria, and they will just rot off. So remember to watch your watering levels. And then with people having asked all those questions, they have forgotten, when do Cymbidiums flower? Because they haven't seen the Cymbidium flowers for a long time, they've forgotten what time of year. Cymbidium's flowering period depends on the type of Cymbidium that they have or the hybrid that they have. Flowers will generally initiate any time from late summer through autumn and into winter and spring. So depending on the type of orchid you have and when your specific diurnal temperatures change enough to produce flower initiation is the season that your orchid is going to flower. The HTC Cymbidiums, the heat tolerant Cymbidiums, generally flower slightly earlier than the cool flowering Cymbidiums, which will then flower generally in that early spring phase. That's when you'll see that initial flower spike extension, moving towards full bloom in spring. So you can just keep an eye out around the base of your Cymbidium to check when those little flower spikes are starting to extend out. And in conjunction with that, they'll often ask, do Cymbidiums flower every year? Yes, they will. That's what they genetically programmed to do. It's just we don't give them all the right signals or the right triggers for them to do so when we're growing them ourselves in our different climates. So Cymbidiums should flower every year as long as you are sticking to a proper care regime and you're giving it the right conditions so that it can be triggered into producing the flower spikes. But remember, recently divided plants or plants in poor health may skip a year of flowering while they mature and regrow and rebuild their strength. And the last question, generally the most desperate one, is why are my flowering buds yellowing and falling off before the flowers actually even open? There could be a few little things that have happened to your orchid to have caused this. If you get too many different temperature changes, if your temperature swings are too violent, your flowering spike has initiated and those buds have come, and then you get sudden drop in temperatures, especially daytime temperatures or very, very cold nighttime temperatures where your day temperatures don't increase again, this can cause bud blast. All your buds will then abort and fall off. So those sudden swings in temperature can be problematic. Also, humidity levels. If your humidity levels are too low, you're going to have the same effect. So for instance, if you've moved your Cymbidium from outdoors and you've brought it indoors because you've seen those buds starting to be produced. If you don't keep your humidity levels high enough indoors, all of those buds are very likely going to fall off. So you'll end up with a terrible disappointment. So if you are moving your plant around like that at those points, please be sure you're putting it in an environment that's fairly similar to where it's just come from, so that you can keep all those buds stuck on your plant. Okay, so I think we've gone through all those frequently asked Cymbidium questions. If there's any other questions that you want to know the answer to, just drop them in the comments down below. Any other information that you may want, remember Ed posts a lot of content in that Buy Me a Coffee link all the time. There's a lot of free information available down there, so don't be shy, go down, have a look, and there is some gated members only content. So go down, sign up, become a member, and grow like a pro. And thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.